Okay, thanks very much, and thank you for the presentations. I just want to ask of Teagasc, please. Your presentation was very comprehensive, but just to ask a couple of questions of stuff that you put in there. First of all, can you explain what you mean by the following? The setting of a national target for LULUCF, land use and change forestry, has been deferred to allow new scientific knowledge emerge. Because it seems to me that we have a pretty good idea what's right and what's wrong in terms of land use. We know, and I think you are open about it there, that Sitka spruce is clearly wrong, that spreading large quantities of fertiliser to continue growing the dairy herd is wrong, and that reducing and cutting back our hedgerows are wrong. So what more scientific knowledge are we waiting for to develop a land use policy that is fit for this climate and biodiversity emergency? And the other question I have for you is, we know how potent methane gas is and that we must reduce it immediately. And we know that the safest way to do that is to reduce the herd, while the riskiest way to do it is to try to get genetic medication and tinker around with animal feeds. So what exactly are we waiting for in terms of scientific breakthroughs? It's kind of similar to the last question. And then my final question is on the hedgerows themselves, that given the role that hedgerows could play in terms of biodiversity and also for carbon removal, do you have any views on the legislation that was passed some years ago that allowed for greater leeway in cutting back and removing hedgerows? And was it a mistake? Should we seek to reverse that and protect and restore the hedgerows and all of the biodiversity around it, as well as at the same time financially reward farmers who are the custodians of the land for preserving them?
Okay, thank you, Deputy Smith, for the question. So the first one in relation to the LULUCF. What that means is the government set sectoral targets and agreed those last July for all the sectors, and there was a lot of debate and discussion at the time, and if you recall, the one which we were most interested in was the agriculture target was set at 25%, and all other sectors, energy, transport and so on, had their sectoral targets set. But the LULUCF sector was not set at that time. And that's the land use change and forestry. And I was very careful to actually go to the wording of the press release at the time, which said that it was deferred for 18 months to allow new scientific knowledge to emerge. And that was the wording of the government statement at the time. And I suppose from my perspective and from our perspective, the scientific knowledge that you're right in terms of we know an awful lot about the practices that will impact on this. But as we outlined in our statement, there's huge uncertainties around the emissions from land, and in particular emissions from drained agricultural peats. First of all, we're not 100% sure what the area of those in the country is. It's somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 hectares. There is research ongoing at the moment to get a better idea as to what the exact area is. The second uncertainty then is we're not sure how well drained those peats are anymore. They were drained back in the 60s and 70s. Anecdotal evidence would suggest that a lot of the drains are no longer working, so those lands have already become re-wetted to some or a great extent. So that's the second uncertainty. How effective are the drains that we're assuming are still working? How effective are they anymore? And the third uncertainty there is what are the actual emissions from those drained peatlands? We're currently assuming in our national inventory using the default values, because we don't have national values yet, we're assuming they're emitting, I think it's about 20 tonnes per hectare. But that may not be correct, and we're currently in the process of putting in place this soil carbon observatory to give us actual measurements on these drained peatlands, and it may turn out to be higher, but it may turn out to be lower. So there's three big levels of uncertainty, I suppose, as to what is the extent of the emissions from these drained agricultural peatlands. That's not to say that you're not 100% right. We know what we can do to reduce the emissions, whatever they are. There are definitely emissions from them, and we know that things like re-wetting, or partial or full re-wetting or whatever will reduce those emissions. But I think we have to try to get greater certainty as to what are the parameters with which we're working, what is the extent of the emissions. And I suppose a very interesting piece of work that we're doing is to see how much of those emissions, whether it's 20 or 30 or 10 tonnes of CO2 per hectare. How much of that can we re-wet while still being able to maintain a certain level of agricultural activity on those soils by what we call partial re-wetting, or bringing the water table up to maybe 20 or 30 centimetres below ground level, as opposed to total flooding of those soils. So that's, I suppose, where the research questions are that we're trying to answer.
Yeah, just to clarify, I mean, the statement that I'm querying says that it has been deferred to allow new scientific knowledge emerge. What you've described to me there are uncertainties in measurements.
Yeah.
I wouldn't quite categorise them as equal to new scientific knowledge, would you?
I would. Well, you know, it's a very scientific challenging endeavour now to quantify what the emissions are on those soils. You know, we're investing a lot of money and we have a lot of researchers and technologists involved in that. So it is definitely challenging to do that. And it will be actually quite a big job to, I think, establish the drainage status of those soils once we have identified where they are. And again, you know, to know what is a drained peat soil or a peat soil, there's a definition of peat, I think, there has to be 40 centimetres of peat. So, you know, what might looking in from the road like that, it falls into the definition of a peat soil. When you actually go to measure the amount of peat, and it mightn't be peat soil at all. So there is a lot of uncertainty, but I suppose the other thing, as my colleague here has reminded me, that the land use review is currently underway, and I think that was very much in the government's mind when they deferred the setting of the LULUCF
and when
target.
do we expect that to be completed?
I think the end of next year, Lily.
Yeah, so phase one has just, thank you, Deputy. Phase one has just been completed, so currently the final report is under development, but that was very much an evidence gathering piece of work, seeing where we are at in terms of land use, what we know, ownership, indicators that might be relevant and so forth. And there were some pieces of work outsourced in terms of looking at socioeconomics around land use and scenarios related to climate. But what will happen now is that a second phase will commence, and that should be the end of next year, but that's going to look at more deeply some of the research gaps that will emerge as part of phase one.
For the end of next year. I know we're running out of time, but could you try and address the other two questions, please?
In relation to methane, certainly, look, reducing animal numbers will directly reduce methane emissions, but I suppose, you know, that can be devastating for the farmers involved and their income.
I don't want to go there because it isn't on the agenda for today. It is very important of it, but this is the land use, the sequestration.
It's hard to get an answer to that question.
Yeah, but I want to be fair to Teagasc, who came in on the basis.
Okay, but look, I can give a 10-second answer.
If you want to give a 10-second answer, go ahead.
I suppose we are trying to find alternative ways to reduce emissions from the cattle herd without having to remove or reduce the cattle herd. And with regard to hedgerows, which is related, I guess, to sequestration, I might ask Lillian, who's an expert in hedgerows, to deal with that.
Thank you, Professor. Yeah, so again, in terms of that work, we have a project that's recently finishing up. So as Professor Mara said, there has been quite a lot of work done to be able to understand the extent of hedgerows, which is actually not an easy task. But now with the technologies that are available to us out there, we know in terms of the remote technologies what works to be able to tell us the extent. But what we hadn't done prior to the current project was look at taking direct measurements so we could ground truth these remote measurements. And through this work, for the first time now, we do have biomass equations that can be related to management. And with regard to that, we have two distinct types of hedgerows emerging: our very overly managed, more intensively managed hedgerows, what I like to call the short back and sides, versus our more escaped hedgerows. And the results are what you would expect. Of course, there's a lot more carbon stock and sequestration potential associated with those wider, more escaped hedgerows. So we have scientific publication gone on this and a final report related to that. We also found a positive relationship with biodiversity, all of which is the type of science that will be able to try and address and answer the type of questions and issues you raise here this morning.
Okay.
Thanks very much.
Mr. Volcon, did you want to come in on this?
Yeah, just a couple of quick points. I found it very interesting that you're using working assumption of 20 tonnes per hectare emissions for agricultural lands. The figures I gave you for 10 million tonnes were based on the latest research, which is actually 10 tonnes was the assumption. So we've used very conservative figures which are based in science fact. But the reality is that I think the Deputy is right, Deputy Smith. that in fact it isn't scientific knowledge, it isn't scientific breakthroughs we're looking at, it's actual measurements that need to be carried out. And I mean, I'd recognise that Teagasc actually has put in place a number of eddy covariance towers. So we need to, we need to get going. That is one of the recommendations I have. We need better measurements on a broad scale across the country.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for that.